Great. So, welcome back to the second part of our conversation. So, as we mentioned this morning, one of the things that we really wanted to do in this meeting was roll up one level from a lot of the activity and advocacy and debate going on in national governments and civil society, in industry actors around the world who are attempting to address in a variety of ways online harms. But we've seen relatively modest, at least formal, international governance coordination and innovation. But one of the things we want to explore in this discussion is whether we should be thinking a lot more creatively when we look to the global level. Yes, there may be a role for international institutions, multilateral institutions, and it'd be interesting to hear from the group we've assembled on the degree to which they believe they can address some of the challenges of the digital age, but also whether there's more innovative forms of governance that involve different sets of actors, different kinds of mechanisms, different ways of trying to shape behavior. So what we want to try to get at in this first afternoon discussion is how to innovate in governance sort of beyond the state when we're looking at this particular problem. So we have an amazing panel to address this question. We worked so hard to try to find a set of voices that could help us think this through, and many of those who are online, I'm kind of pinching myself because there was so many moving parts, and so to get you all here has just been absolutely fabulous. I'm going to just rearrange the order slightly because Paul Ash, who's in New Zealand, has to leave us at 2 p.m. And so I'm going to bring him up to second place, and I'm going to move Rana, who's the nice Canadian, offering to be at the back end. So I'm going to split them. But what we're going to do is something very similar as we did this morning. I'll give each of the panelists sort of 8 to 10 minutes to provide some introductory remarks, and then hopefully we can have a bit more of an exchange and then questions from you. But I'd really like to start with David Kaye, who I'm so pleased to meet, even if only virtually, who I know has thought a lot about these issues from his experience as a special rapporteur within the Geneva-based special procedures system in thinking about particularly freedom of expression. But really, David, to kick us off in thinking about to what extent can some of the tools that we have internationally be adapted to help protect populations from online harms? How can we think about using them in traditional and non-traditional ways? But also, do you see a role for new institutions or mechanisms, public or private, that can also get at this question? So, David, I'd love to start with you.
Great, Jennifer, thanks so much. Oh, I have a little bit of, now it's good. I had a little feedback there. So these are really, first off, what an amazing panel. It is so great. I wish we were all in person to spend time kind of on the margins also. And I want to thank you and everyone at McGill for including me here. So I think what I want to do is address two of the questions that were posed. So one is about regional / multilateral tools, and the other is about new institutions. And I think it's hard, if not impossible, to have this conversation, at least on the regional and multilateral side, without acknowledging that there are already tools that exist and also tools that are being put on the market, let's say, that are going to be, I think, over the coming years, very meaningful in how we think about online governance, and probably meaningful in ways that we don't fully understand right now. So I'll just mention two of them. I think one is, Jennifer, what you mentioned, which is the multilateral human rights system. So, I mean, the multilateral human rights system, when I think about it, involves, a bunch of different pieces. It involves at the international level things like the Human Rights Council and Special Procedures, which is the network of special rapporteurs in all sorts of areas that that focus on human rights in generic ways, meaning like in an entire programmatic space or in a country specific way. But they have increasingly over the last 5 to 7 years, or going back maybe to even to 2011 with reporting by my predecessor, Frank LaRue, a special rapporteur on freedom of expression, focused on the way in which online space needs to be governed so as to protect vulnerable populations, but also to protect freedom of expression, right to protest, and other sort of fundamental rights in the international system. And so we've seen over time, not only that particular mandate, both in the work that Frank did, the work I did, and the current special rapporteur Irene Khan is doing now. We've seen, I think, quite a bit of, I don't know if I'd call it oversight, but we have seen certainly a focus on online governance in a way that I think gives some normative tools for people and institutions to be using. So that's one element at the international side, and we could drill down into those issues in those areas as well. The other, of course, is the network of regional human rights courts, which have increasingly paid attention. This is particularly true of the European Court of Human Rights, but it's also true of the African Court on Human and People's Rights and the sub-regional courts like the East African Court of Justice and the ECOWAS Court in West Africa, but also in the Inter-American Court and Inter-American Commission. There's been an increasing focus on the way in which online rights, or let's say human rights, are mediated in online spaces. And those are forms for online governance. I mean, they really are, in many respects, I mean, depending on the jurisdiction, having a meaningful impact on how states regulate online speech. And I think a lot of that work, particularly out of the European Court, but also in the other courts and in commissions and the special rapporteur in particular for the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights, have had, I think, a meaningful impact on how we think about the norms of human rights in online spaces. So at the regional and multilateral levels, I mean, really that's just sort of scratching the surface. And there's a lot more to say about that, but those are two ways in which I would think about that space. The other, of course, is the emergence of the Digital Services Act in the European Union. Recently adopted. It won't be in effect for some time, and whether it's actually implemented in a way that goes beyond implementation of the GDPR. I mean, I think there are a lot of questions around it, but the fundamental point of the DSA, which I think we just don't know the outcome of yet, and I don't even think we will know for some time, is whether transparency matched with risk assessment will actually have a meaningful impact on online governance. It's an experiment in many ways. It's an experiment that I imagine other states and perhaps regional institutions will follow. But it's very interesting as a model, and I think it's really open as to how that actually impacts the space. The last thing I would say, because I know we have several just amazing panelists, and I want to stop and hear from them myself, is the question of new institutions, and the way the question was framed and what was sent to me was, what new institutions or mechanisms, including forms of private governance, could be developed to address these kinds of issues, and can we borrow from other policy domains? What I would say here, I mean, are two things. One is whatever one thinks about the Facebook Oversight Board as a model, it's been very interesting. It has, kind of created an approach to online governance that sort of gives a nod to platform values, whatever those are, but really is making decisions based on human rights norms. And I think that's super interesting. You know, whether they get it right or wrong is immaterial at some level, because what's interesting is this a model that is possible to replicate at scale? And the key question for me is whether it's a model that can be replicated across the industry, however we define the industry. Because the oversight board, it's a self-regulatory approach, but it's really limited. I mean, it is limited to Facebook or to Meta. And I think moving forward, a big question for us all who are thinking about online governance is whether that model can be kind of extrapolated into something that is more of a kind of cross-industry oversight approach, which I think would be based on the assumption that states regulating content will always lead into bad places, and is a model that particularly bad actors would abuse. And so is there a model that is that would work across industry, that adopts kind of the principles that we're seeing develop in the Facebook Oversight Board, but could be applied in a broader, even global context? So I'll stop there. Those are my sort of initial kind of, you know, throwing some points out into the mix for discussion.
That's fantastic. And you introduced exactly what we hoped you would, which is ways of thinking about both private governance and existing tools. And we may come back to think about how those first set of tools actually operate, and how civil society actors are using them, how they're being leveraged, I think is a really interesting question for us to consider. I'm going to turn to our friend in New Zealand next, given the time, Paul Ash, who has been part of a fascinating conversation in New Zealand in response to tragic events in that country, to work towards an initiative or forms of activity that would help to address online harms, in particularly in his role as the Prime Minister's Special Representative on Cyber and digital issues. So, Paul, it's wonderful to have you here with us virtually. We know you had a very busy week, and we're glad that we were able to make the timing work. We'd love to hear from you on this set of questions.
Well, kia ora tātou katoa. It's fantastic to be able to join you from New Zealand today. It's relatively early in the morning, but not unusual for us. In our time zone, we're reasonably used to working through a range of different times of day to be able to engage with colleagues and counterparts. And congratulations to the team at McGill for the speakers you've assembled. I'm absolutely humbled to be talking alongside some of them, and absolutely delighted at the perspectives I've already heard from David, and I know Kate and Rana and the rest of the team will bring into the mix. In thinking through the questions you've posed for us about existing global, regional, multilateral tools and their adaptation to protect populations from online harms, I think we probably faced a very, very stark examination of that very question after 15 March 2019, as we looked at not only the murder of 51 people at prayer, but the way that live stream went global, and the impact that had globally through the exploitation and abuse of online platforms. And as we thought about our response to that, it was evident to us that we needed something that had a whole range of different elements in it. We would probably need to think about better regulatory measures down the track at one end of the spectrum. And at the other, we had a very strong view that we needed a much better conversation and engagement across the different players involved in this challenge. Governments, the affected communities, those who've been working in the online space for a very long time, those like David who've been so strong on ensuring that human rights protections and a free, open and secure internet are maintained as this work is carried out. And we needed to find a way to bring those voices together. For us, three things were critically important. First, that we couldn't actually do nothing in response to what had happened after Christchurch. The impact of that was such large scale, and the exploitation of online platforms meant we absolutely felt our duty and our obligation to try and find a way to improve that situation. The second for us was that we needed to start, and David's comments I think reinforce this perfectly, start with the corpus of international human rights law. We already have a strong foundation across everything that has spun out from the Universal Declaration and the two covenants onwards. And it's really important from our perspective in New Zealand that we grounded the work we were doing in that. We've long had a view over in the world of cybersecurity, for instance, that the law applies online as it does offline. International law applies in that way. And we were very conscious of the need to ground our work in that and not to in any way either undermine that or open up the door for those that would seek to do so. The second key thing for us was that we were focused very much on ensuring that we retained a free, open and secure internet at a time when it's increasingly under threat, and that we needed to be quite thoughtful and careful about how we did that as well. And the last really was that we couldn't do nothing. There was a need to act, and we couldn't let concerns around both a free, open and secure internet and the need to respect international human rights law and advance it, act as barriers to that work, but actually as and see if we could make them enablers. We took a look at existing institutions. We looked everywhere. We looked at the UN. We looked at regional and plurilateral organisations. We tested some of the existing mechanisms that were in place. What we found was a proliferation of regional, global, and in some instances, multi-stakeholder bodies trying to grapple with this problem, but struggling to either find the mechanisms or tools to do so. And all of them had some aspects of a solution, but it was actually quite difficult to find a forum where a dedicated focus that was multi-stakeholder and involved all the players in the conversation was actually working on a specific problem set that related to the work we grappled with in Christchurch. We, in that sense, then looked at how we could pull together some of the parties that particularly focus on this issue. We worked with some of the companies, and we started with the premise that they didn't really want this content on their platforms any more than we did. And actually that they had been taken by surprise, and we can argue over whether they should have been or not, but that the exploitation of their platforms had been effective and demonstrated some very, very significant issues that they needed to work on. We also, as we carried this work out, thought very hard about the need to do that work collaboratively and to bring a range of different players into the room. And one of the, I guess, issues we had to overcome at the very beginning was quite a bit of suspicion about how that might work. Were we going to be able to do that genuinely? Were we going to be able to carve out space to make sure that the affected communities and impacted communities had a voice, but equally that those advocating for freedom of expression online, freedom of assembly and human rights law also had a voice. And that's been a really important part of our work. The focus on that has required an awful lot of time, confidence building, and we just saw this with the Christchurch Call Summit we had last month in New York, where as the summit got closer, it became evident that we needed to be focusing in on ensuring that both the governmental leaders, the industry leaders and the civil society leaders who all wanted to be at the table were actually prepared and given confidence in their ability to have a conversation that could be facilitated and reasonably free-flowing. And a number of governmental staff, for instance, defaulted to the idea they wanted some set-piece statements and their leader needed to be at a particular place in the priority. The companies wanted some assurance that their general counsel would not be unhappy with the way the conversation was tracking. the civil society folk wanted to be there and present at the table and having an equal voice, and then realised that actually that meant a really chunky set of conversations and a unique opportunity to present some of their perspectives. And it was, some of that's a bit of a simplification, but in effect, we watched the need for human beings across these different places to sit down and build confidence in working together. And it meant we were able to get some really interesting issues out on the table and have a real conversation. To do that, one of the key things we've found is it's important to distinguish between the policy outcomes we're looking to achieve, and we've got a number of those set out, say, in the Christchurch call, and the methods we use to get there. And there's a discovery phase in here that's really important, actually understanding the nature of the problems that all of the actors in the online sphere face, and then looking at how we collaboratively build policy solutions for that. And to that, I think on your second question about new institutions or mechanisms, I think we are seeing a proliferation of new mechanisms. We've probably added to that with the Christchurch call, but I'm not sure that that's actually a bad thing at the moment. What it speaks of to me is a time when societies are having to adapt quite rapidly to the implications of the online world, that we're not actually particularly well prepared to do so at the moment, and that there's a fair bit of testing and experimentation. And I think, to David's point, the regulatory frameworks that the European Union is developing are a major contributor to working our way through that. And it will be really interesting to see how those step forward. I can speak to something that we've just launched that I think may actually contribute usefully to that discussion. But something like the Oversight Board is also a really interesting test and model to see just how private governance will work. And I guess our sense has been that for the online environment, we're going to need a mix of public and private governance, and we're going to need to spend some time trying to work through what works and what doesn't, and ensure that the conversation is opened up in a way that we can be slightly experimental about some of that stuff with care, but that a multi-stakeholder framework for doing that will give us the best chances of ensuring we've got useful checks and balances in that process. In doing that, as we look for places to work and ways to take our work forward, we did look at other models, and I would say there's some very useful ones that have been built in place in fields like cybersecurity, where we look very, very carefully at some of the models for information sharing and for problem solving. I think in other areas of online challenges, some of the work around child sexual exploitation, where collaboration has been able to be built, has also been useful. We also looked a bit more broadly, though. There are many issues that come out of it, fields like public health or social sciences that we think need to be brought into this discussion, and the way we've built the commitments in the Christchurch call reflects that. If I think about the danger of conflict between different governments' arrangements, yes, there is a danger there, but there always is in any field. If we think about the multiple different regulatory models that states have found for grappling with public safety challenges, trade policy, the fields you could pick are very, very large, but there is regularly a process where we're dealing with new issues where states take a range of different models, the private sector does, civil society does, and over time we see a degree of convergence. That can be quite challenging if it means regulatory blocks form that clash. But if I think about trade policy over the years, there has been a reasonably strong set of ground rules built. If I think more broadly about international human rights law, one of the great challenges for New Zealand of trying to work on this problem was that we are very, very strong believers in the multilateral rules-based order, and that we found it actually ill-suited at the moment to try to grapple with this problem. There is a corpus and a key of really important legal work, but we were looking at an environment where the multilateral institutions have really struggled to bring diverse voices into the discussion, and indeed where a number of states are actively working to remove them from that discussion, and we've seen that in cyber and other areas. So for us, this issue of multiple fora is problematic. It's actually difficult just to service them, but it's probably an important part of the process of testing how states citizens and business can survive and thrive in this environment, and one that we will then need to look at some mechanisms. If I just give the example briefly before I close of the Christchurch call, we've had quite a lot of interest now in bundling other issues into it. David and I have talked about this before, so has the Christchurch call community, that because the model seems to be one that is making some progress on a very tight problem set, a number of people have suggested adding other problem sets to the mix. We, as a call community, tested this at our last summit and came to the conclusion that actually we do want to keep the problem set tight, because we think if we do that, we stand a better prospect of making progress, and that if we can then make progress in the area we're working on, we might be able to take the model over into other areas without actually importing them into the model that we already have. So there is some thought going into, for instance, the problem of state-sponsored information operations that has come into sharp relief with Russia's aggression against Ukraine, and the question of how we think about managing those and what multi-stakeholder frameworks look like. We are going to need public and private sector collaboration and citizen input into that. So can we come up with a model that works on that learns from the things that we've been working on in the Christchurch call? And then how do we think about tying those together? And that is an active discussion now. I'll stop right there because that's quite a lot to throw out into the mix. But I think the questions you've raised are really pertinent, and they're front of mind for us right at the moment.
Thanks so much, Paul. And it was really interesting to hear, this discussion of fragmentation as a virtue and a vice, right? As in so many areas of governance, we have overlapping arrangements, and we tend to initially think of that as something negative, but it is a reality, and it can also be managed. But also your point about that you really think about three constituencies and affected communities you want to have in the dialogue with companies and with states. So thank you so much. Kate, I'm going to turn to you, Kate Klonick, Associate Professor of Law at St. John's University. It's great to have you online. I'm glad you made it, Kate, to join in the discussion. And to the degree you want to pick up on some of the things that have been discussed as potential models, that would be great. But we'd also just love to hear your perspective on innovative approaches to thinking about this as a global governance problem. So welcome.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. I'm very sad that I can't be in Montreal right now with everyone. But this, as everyone has said, is an incredible panel, and I've been looking forward to learning from everyone on it going forward. And then, I've also just learned so much just now from David and Paul. So I'm going to kind of pick up and do a framing, essentially, of kind of these models, because I've been thinking about this a lot in trying to work on a paper that I'm working on that specifically addresses some of the concerns that have come up around structural antitrust in the United States, which has kind of forced me into kind of this reckoning of what the entire landscape looks like. And so I just kind of will say that I think that something that as a foundational matter doesn't get addressed enough is the setting up of the framing of the problem of the speech platform is in many ways a very unique problem, in that it falls directly into a hole that already exists in the law. We've never been good at dealing with these trade-offs between speech and harm and expression and surveillance and censorship and governance. These are all kind of very difficult problems. And to a certain extent, the fact that we can't find perfect solutions to this is a commentary on both kind of the global nature of this problem at scale, the new kind of public and private trade-offs that we're being forced to confront at scale, and the market trade-offs that we're forced to confront at scale. And so I just kind of, to set this up, I think one of the things that happens a lot is that we have these conversations and there's a lot of, oh, this is what's new here, this is this new problem. And that I think that is actually there are some huge differences and changes in how this happened. But at the very fundamental level, I think that this is a pretty intractable problem that has always existed in the world. So I have kind of four models that I think have emerged kind of to speak to the borderlessness and the public-private law trade-offs around kind of speech. And so I'll just kind of go through each of those, and they'll be familiar, which is that you have kind of, I would say, a very market-driven approach about platforms for rules of speech. And this is kind of a 1997 cyber libertarianism idea of David Johnson and David Post, who wrote kind of this illusions of like the borderless world, and how essentially predicting that essentially platforms would end up creating markets of rules, and that consumers and individuals would choose between those markets of rules. And I would endeavor to say that, like with Kanye buying Parler and Truth Social proliferating right now, and Gab, at least to a certain extent, this is something that's happening. There are different markets for different rules. There are different services and products that each of the platforms are providing for people, and certain promises that they're making for process, for procedure, for substantive governance. And so I think that that's worth kind of raising again. The second is kind of the Jack Goldsmith and Tim Wu idea and who controls the internet, which is this recapitulation of geopolitical struggles this predicted that the geopolitical struggles and nation state power grabs would just basically replicate themselves in the internet, right? And take place through control over platforms, or control over markets, or control over kind of border protections. And so there is this, and I think frankly that the DSA, the DMA, a lot of what you're seeing with certain types of laws and regulations that can't get passed in the United States, happening in other areas of the world, and forcing platforms into this Brussels effect, this compliance. This is part of what's happening. And of course you have China and the EU and the US, and then the majority world all kind of in conversation in this way. But you have some of the old power players, the ones that China and EU and the US. The third model is, of course, David Kaye's model, and kind of the international stakeholder model of Paul, also just that we're seeing this proliferation of multi-stakeholderism and intermediary institutions. And this is also, frankly, I think, the oversight board, which was I would say, from a private platform type of perspective, was truly kind of a new endeavor in this form, that this wasn't coming from something related to government. This wasn't coming from civil society. This wasn't coming even from industry as a whole, but from one specific platform. And so I think people know that I covered the formulation of the board very closely, and watched it very closely. And there was a great deal, I think there still is, a great deal of skepticism about its independence and a lot of things. But some of that has actually, I'm pretty surprised that has actually proven to be, people still have plenty of qualms with it, but the independence and the idea that it's in the pocket of big tech, or in the pocket of Meta, has really kind of, I think, mostly disappeared. And the role that it's playing in kind of the larger, broader international human rights conversation has become much more significant and really important. Two last models, and then I promise I'll wrap up. One of the things that I've been having a lot of conversations with majority world stakeholders, which is the desire for, and the awareness of the ways in which US technology platforms like this invisibly exported, almost in an imperialist model, a lot of the US norms and law, either directly in their rules, or kind of built into the design and code of their platforms, onto other countries. And a desire not for this international model, which they think will also serve kind of these elitist kind of centers of multi-stakeholderism and international power. But honestly, I've heard a lot of people calling for a Balkanization type movement, of a literal, we will make the rules in our own country, and we will decide what the substantive law is, and we don't need kind of the tech companies coming in, or our interests encapsulated by other types of international, like giant international panels or things like that. And so I just wanted to mention that because I would say that like generally because of the feasibility of that and like what it would actually mean, I don't know how much power that it has, but I do think it has an important role in raising some very important impact and justice concerns, specifically around the majority world and how they are continually impacted by kind of these conversations that they're not a part of. And then the last part is kind of we'll come full circle back to like libertarianism, but not to kind of the libertarianism of the market in terms of platforms and companies, but in terms of the empowering of individuals. And I will say this is like the move and the push for the technological solution that empowers individuals and takes the power for these conversations out of the hands of the platforms, out of the hands of the international stakeholders, out of the hands of the nation states, which have very considerable free expression concerns in them being the controlling factor here, and desires to put them in the hands of the users. And this is kind of the interoperability movement, the protocol over platforms movement, the API movement, the end-to-end encryption movement, the data portability movement. The problem with this, of course, is that in enabling individuals, you enable individuals to harm each other and to harm each other really prolifically. And so this solves on one hand, like some of the choice issues and the censorship issues and the power struggles that are happening and the internet has always offered kind of a utopian solution towards. But then frankly, if we're so naive as to think that this will be the only way that we have this solution, I think that this would also be an error in some way. We do want kind of some type of gatekeepers on a lot of these functions. So these 5 models, okay, like which I kind of have just been kind of batting around, and I'm sure someone has come up with them in a more cohesive way than I have just now. But these are all just, I would say that the only mistake we can make is to take one of these models and to say that this is the solution. This has only been a conversation, really, even among insiders and people with knowledge for 20 at most 30 years. And this has really only reached public consciousness in the past 5 to 7 years. And I just think that this is a giant system that we are not fully understanding the technological capabilities or how any one particular lever getting pulled will have trade-offs in, like, you know, a butterfly flaps its wings in Silicon Valley and Myanmar has a genocide. And so I think that there is literally just a very, very kind of slow and careful and having a commitment to understanding that all of these models have value, all of them surface certain types of concerns that are all valid in different ways, and that we should basically kind of, not to be like the Pollyanna wait and see approach, but a little bit like let's slow our roll and kind of sit down and like not make the mistake of thinking that the solution to all of this is going to be a US administrative agency, or the solution to all of this is going to be to just break up the platforms and have like some type of international stakeholder group be in control of them, but actually kind of watching as these different formulations play out and trusting that they will continue to kind of serve these balancing functions in a problem that we have always had and will continue to have in many, many years from now.
Thanks, Kate. And I love it when people create models like that to get us to think around, distinctions between different approaches. And it's extremely interesting to take on board your recommendation that we also need to watch how they're operating and the kind of effects that they're having. And underpinning some of what David said, but also we started to talk about it this morning. I mean, when you think about the governance structures for human rights generally, we also know that the protection and promotion of human rights over the last 75 years or more has taken place through a variety of mechanisms and a variety of approaches to governance, right? Not all the same. You have, even just in Geneva, you have 3 or 4 different types of arrangements that are meant to work towards, let alone looking outside of formal governance. So it's very helpful to have them at our fingertips in that way, including one that it sounds like is governance by dominance, right? Governance by the exportation of a single model. That's a form of governance. It just might not be one that is as normatively desirable as some others, right? So let me bring in Katherine. I now go to my two in-person folks to round us up. It's been great to have you with us the last day and a half. I know you've been thinking about these issues a lot in your formal role with the Wikimedia Foundation, but also in a variety of ways over the last several years. So please, we'd love to hear your thoughts on these questions of how we think about existing tools, new approaches, but also maybe on the dangers of overlap, or maybe it's embracing some of this complexity, and we have to be careful with, we have to be comfortable with that ambiguity and that fragmentation.
Well, I think, first of all, I just really appreciate the opportunity to be in dialogue with the rest of the panel. So much has been said that I think I strongly agree with. And when you bring up the point of complexity and ambiguity, those used to be two values we would screen for when we would interview people at the Wikimedia Foundation. So I feel as though very much at home here. And I think to Kate's point, the idea of this complexity of overlapping models, I really appreciated the articulation that you made there, Kate, over those 5 models. They resonated very strongly, I think. In my own experience, it addresses something that I did want to speak to a little bit, which is the idea of the norm production and governance at the scale of the network, right? Which is this idea that we would even have a series of, or a set of normative values that we can agree upon at the scale of the 4 billion or so people who are connected in the world today. Which is not to say that that is a sort of explicit rebuke or challenge to the universal human rights framework that I think many, if not all of us on this panel agree with needs to be sort of foundational to any of these conversations, but really is just about how do you tease out some of the variance in norms that exist with even fairly homogenous populations. And so like the example I always like to use on this, and when it comes to privacy, is if you've ever been to the Netherlands, it is a social value / norm that people do not put curtains on their windows. And if you've ever been to Germany or Switzerland, people put curtains on their windows, and you are looked at as though you're very strange if you do not, right? And these are different norms of privacy in a neighboring country context where many values are shared, many of those liberal Western values that we associate with the same sort of universal rights paradigm are shared, and yet these two sort of cultures adopt, or the 3, I guess I mentioned 3 countries, adopt very different approaches to privacy in this regard, which is in the Netherlands, you have, if you put curtains up, you have something to hide, and transparency is a value, and which is actually interesting because the Dutch government's been trying to get people to put curtains on their windows for climate purposes and sort of heating bills. And how do you change that norm is sort of an interesting question that they've been grappling with. And if you go to somewhere like Switzerland, the idea is that you focus on privacy because otherwise your personal life is an intrusion into the commons, right? And so norms are highly circumscribed by the communities that we live in. They are socially enforced expectations. And the idea that we're going to get to a place in which we can have some sort of arrangement in which we scale these norms to the network of 4 billion is just unreasonable to expect. And I think it's really important that we start with an understanding of the fact that we are working in this sort of socially determined paradigm, and then we try to find ways to accommodate for that. And that's why I really like the idea of these multiple overlapping frameworks and sort of the adaptability and extensibility to edge cases. And so obviously there's this interplay of law and norms, and I can talk a little bit about some of the challenges there of governance, and certainly just want to sort of emphasize the idea that all of this should be underpinned, even when we talk about norms, by this universal respect for human rights and protection and minority rights within pluralistic and majoritarian societies and everything else. But still, there needs to be space for variance. So that sort of brings me, I think, a little bit to some of the models that I've seen around governance that I think are interesting, that maybe we haven't touched on quite so fully. The private governance models of the Oversight Board, I'd love to actually have a little bit of a deeper dive on that. I think it's very exciting that it exists. With all due skepticism, I also think it's giving a lot of its power away. And I think that there are some interesting ways in which that model can be iterated on to be much stronger. I'm also a believer that sort of model needs to be highly platform dependent. And so it's not only a question of may there be many models that bloom, but in fact, are there ways in which this could be replicated for individual platforms. I tend to think that while we group big tech into a series of buckets that are highly undifferentiated for the purpose of discourse, and that's fine, at the level of regulation, specifically for the nature of harm, we actually need to be much more specific because the business models are not the same. The products are not the same. The algorithms are not the same. The ad models are not the same. The user base is not the same for all of these different companies. And so it's actually quite important, again, that we're not trying to come to this conversation with some sort of expectation of one framework across one ring to rule them all, really, but an understanding that there's going to need to be differentiation within that. And that might be the difference, again, between sort of norms and universal values. And so I've seen also an interesting, I don't know how it played out, effort by the French government to experiment with sort of this idea of co-regulation, which was the embedding of regulators within private platforms. I think the model was, they were exploring that with Facebook, and I haven't been party to any of the conversations to see where that's gone, but the idea was really that you would be able to have obligations to the body public, but access to the sort of specific data and product decisions that were being made that were affecting French citizens. And was it possible then to have a much more bespoke model to regulation that was also much more dynamic in keeping with the way that product and platform development actually occurs, which is a closed loop system in which products are iterating on a weekly, if not daily basis, so that you're actually having a much more reactive approach to having these conversations around harms than the sort of like waterfall development style of policy that existing in most democratic legislatures today. So I think that's sort of an interesting model that could use a little bit more conversation. I think the other one that, I can talk a little bit about is this idea of like co-development, which is something that we adhered to very strongly at Wikipedia, in which we looked at content, code, product, policy, trust and safety, government affairs, and even our sort of finance and governance models as all areas where we would co-develop policies and not exactly co-regulate, because I think regulation is specifically a government function, but co-develop and co-govern with members of private citizens, essentially members, participants in the Wikipedia community, arguably donors, readers, all of those folks played a role in determining the value systems, the application of policy, and the accountability of the platform itself. And when I used to talk about how this would work, I remember going into conversations maybe 5 years, 7 years ago, and people saying, well, that's really nice that it works for you, but you're a nonprofit, and so therefore, like that would never really work for us. I think we've reached the bounds of the useful limits of the existing models for content moderation for many of these platforms, in the sense that it doesn't work at scale. And so increasingly we're seeing a shift around interest to how might you do this sort of co-development model. I also, as much as I am a deep skeptic of sort of the technological solutionism, which is I think the fifth model Kate talked about of things like Web3, I think that there has been a useful conceptual shift that has enabled around this idea that you actually could bring your users into some sort of governance. You do not need crypto and tokens to do it, just to be 100% explicitly clear, but there may be ways in which the development of that particular stack actually can help accelerate the idea of co-development, not least because, as I said, it creates a conceptual model for doing so, but I think it can help popularize within, and I'm with Anya on this, we don't want to say users or consumers, we want to say citizens, but it can help popularize this idea of co-development and co-ownership of platforms in a way that is a little bit more understandable by the public as a whole. And then the last piece that I think has been sort of largely missing from this conversation, and often is around shareholder governance and the sort of financial models. So we did talk a little bit about the financial incentive models. I'm a big believer, you raise your hand and say, what's the biggest problem? You say, it's the market, right? It's quarterly earnings reports. That is the problem. Like, let's just be explicit about it. But I think that one thing that would be very interesting to think a little bit more about, and this is a place where I think in the sort of social studies, political studies, techno-social space don't have enough of a really sort of strong conceptual grip on, which is what does it mean to actually think about adopting models like employee seats, which are sort of a fundamental part of the way that most large German corporations work, right? As having employee seats on their board. What are the ways in which you can bring members of the public into the regulation of platforms at the level of the fiduciary and governance responsibility that comes with law? And then again, sort of the area of the institutional investors. To multiple points that have been raised here, the regulation of human rights has taken multiple different forms, and the business and human rights space has been a little bit younger to the space, but obviously a place that has grown into maturity relatively quickly, and in some places has been more successful than others. But a lot of that has to do with actually thinking about those end level incentives. And then finally, the question, I promise I will get to finally, I've got more to say, but for this particular introductory, is this idea of self-governance around what does it mean to have the employees and the professional class of this particular sector engage in sort of self-regulatory behavior. And so the models that are always brought up, and of course they have their limitations, as every doctor and lawyer will tell you, is what does it mean to actually have the sort of associations that create standards for their own practitioners and create the sort of continuing education that is required in both of those fields. And so if we see the development of technical products less as a sort of the province of brainiacs and whiz kids, and more of a essentially sort of a trade type function in which there is highly specialized domain knowledge that is regulated in within the field around standards of ethics and sort of professional development. What might that lead to? And it's not going to ever solve all problems. There's always going to be bad actors. There's always going to be the companies that have no problem skirting the law, that outsource things into jurisdictions in which there's limited coverage, there's gray areas. But at least what you're starting to do, instead of creating a downward pressure environment, you're creating an upward pressure environment in which you're creating a sector or a field in which there are expectations. And you could see a number, plausibly, you could imagine some of these larger companies like the Microsofts of the world that have refashioned themselves as good corporate citizens, sort of leaning into something like that. And there's lots of reasons why that hasn't really worked yet, but certainly I don't think that because it hasn't worked yet doesn't mean we shouldn't keep having those conversations. So I think I'll leave it there. Obviously lots more to talk about, but I want to make sure there's time.
Really, really interesting ideas, Katherine. I mean, what I liked about your overview is the invitation to think about governance in a variety of ways. I mean, the idea of co-development, co-regulation. So how do we approach these activities through a more kind of inclusive model? But even self-governance, you really, for me, sparked a question about how models of self-governance or professionals that are linked have actually proven to be really important in other domains. If you think about the nuclear industry, if you think even about what we saw with the pandemic and how whereas we had, from my point of view, very suboptimal intergovernmental cooperation during the pandemic, we actually had professionals of a certain type in the public health field feel the obligation as a good professional to do certain kinds of things, right? And so it's a really interesting idea that works transnationally because these professional organizations tend to be cross-border in many instances. Last but not least, Rana, as the good Canadian, working very much in this space for your role as our tech envoy in the United States. But I know you have a broader interest in issues about how we can collectively, with like-minded countries, but also with other stakeholders, think about online harms in a more creative way. So let me give the last initial word to you.
Well, thank you so much, and I'll be mercifully brief, given that there's been such an enormous and really rich set of propositions that have been put to everyone, and I think that there's so much we can get into, and even just on those last points in terms of what we can take from other industries, I think is something that we might want to dwell back on. But let me just put it into three very quick buckets of how I'm trying to think about it. And one is capacity, and then I want to touch briefly on beyond capacity, this idea of cooperation as a sort of a bigger heuristic, and how we can unpack that a bit. And then finally, this idea of uniqueness and what is unique about the digital space and what's not unique about the digital space. And so what I will say on the first in terms of just capacity is one of the things that I did when I've been in Silicon Valley for about 5 years, really working with a whole sort of this new lattice work of ambassadors and others that are building themselves up as not just in the tech sphere, but also sort of overlapping spheres, but with some with obviously tech at the core of it, and cyber is often, you know, the interspersed category there that we're all finding the edges of. And a couple of key observations of what has been really important there. One is there's obviously some big moments. I think Christchurch Call was a significant moment in terms of the capacity of countries to work outside of existing global institutions. The other is that there's been what I call a lane formation, where all of a sudden, you know, 5 years ago, 7 years ago, you would have conversations where everything was a digital human rights conversation, a data conversation, a privacy conversation. There were someone should do something about, you know, about something. And so there were a lot of very open threads in terms of where governments were focusing. And so I think what we've seen over the last maybe really 5 years has been a significant set of lane formations. So we have now a very distinct harms conversation, a very distinct digital conversation around data, another privacy conversation. Some people say there's been a plethora of fora, like particularly global fora out there. Every time two ministers get together, there's potential for another discussion, and that's, you know, you could look at that and say this is, you know, a problem of scale right now, and we don't have the capacity sort of to look at this. But I think others have said this today. It's not just an issue of there's no silver bullets here. There's silver buckshot, and we are very much still in the problem identification and also testing phase of international forums to get at the core of the set of issues, even the definitional set of issues that we're after. And so I think we should have some, at least, you know, observe where we are in that structure. I think that there's some very short-term things that we could do in terms of, you know, not just capacity building, but also in terms of some of the cooperation that could take place. The very short-term things that we could do is use the calendar. Right now, for instance, you know, not just the G7, the G20s, the OECD, and those are just the Western world, but also sort of the UN mechanisms and many other, you know, the minilateral organizations that have grown up around the world. And so minilateralism is also another thread that we can't miss in the midst of this. We should use the calendar to ensure that the issues of digital harms, but also sort of digital governance, are always on the agenda. And when Apex leaders are in those meetings, they have content that is related to other content that is that builds on one another. And so that's a kind of it's a short-term hack that would move the conversation forward, or move many conversations forward in more profitable ways for us. And so that's just one example of that. In terms of just the bigger cooperation space, I think that one of the interesting ideas of importing models from other industries, look at IATA, for instance. We're in Montreal. This is the home of the aviation sector's governing body. No industry that has been safer per passenger mile, in anything. It's probably a global governance, it's a super story in global governance. And there are many great examples of how we've done this that involve industry and also sort of governance and also consumers at scale that have worked, and arguably that those are good models, as are the new things that we're looking at. The gaming industry, we can't, there are so many great threads of self-governance that have been 30 years in the making, that are a generation of people who have grown up in the midst of these industries, who have brought mimetic forms of governance and have brought an enormous amount of experience to the table. We need to bring that experience and look at modeling some of those forms of experience. I think Wiki is a great example of, an indirect benefactor of some of those models as well. So, and just uniqueness. The only point I'll say on that is, there's obviously an enormous debate as to, have we seen this before, or are there aspects of the digital market sphere that are unique? And what I would say is that clearly we have seen many aspects of this of collective governance action problems before, and we could import human rights model and all of that. I completely agree with. On the uniqueness side, I think that there's another element that of this discussion that we need to delve further into, and it's I don't want to parrot Tristan Harris or others to say the nature and power of these technologies are existentially greater, and if not exponentially greater, than what we've seen in the past, and have real impacts on what it means to be human. And his concept of human degradation is and human betterment, and how technology could be a facility for human betterment. There's a lot of interesting normative conversation that's coming out of a variety of worlds there that I would encourage people to pay attention to. I'll leave it at that.
Thanks so much, Rana. I know, Paul, that you have to leave us quite soon. So I wanted to ask whether you wanted to comment at this stage on perhaps the models that Kate laid out, but also a few of the ideas that Katherine put on the table in terms of more of a shareholder approach, a co-regulation or co-governance approach. I wanted to pick up again on this point that you made in your presentation about the importance of having affected communities at the table as an equal partner alongside some others. So I wanted to give you the chance before you need to leave us to come back in at this stage.
Thanks so much, and apologies for the fact I'm going to have to run in a couple of minutes. I've got another commitment I have to bear. I found the discussion of multiple different models really helpful, and to Catherine's point, I think the piece around working with shareholders, working with those involved in the business is actually really important, and making sure that they're part of that conversation as well. When we put the Christchurch call together, for instance, we looked, coming to David's point actually, we looked at the guiding principles for business and human rights, and actually looked to embed those into a number of the commitments that we built. There are some of those models that I think are starting to become embedded through incremental practice and as a sort of customary approach. And that I think points towards some more holistic ways of trying to solve some of these challenges. I loved Kate's models because it's a really nice way of breaking out the different ways of operating. I guess that the observation I'd make there is we've seen some quite extraordinary outputs as a consequence of just testing different bits of those models, of trying to bring some of them together in the work we do with the call, and look for the best, and rely on the fact that having that range of voices in the room and building confidence among them about working with each other actually helps us to sift a bit what might work and what might not. But I do think it's a time still to be holding some of those different models in tension while we try and work out the signal from the noise, as it were, understanding what actually works, and thinking through effective solutions. I think coming to that point also that Rana made, and I think Katherine made it as well, we're still trying to understand some of the problems here. So if I think about a piece of work, we've just launched the Christchurch Call Initiative on Algorithmic Outcomes. One of the key things for us there is that that's not a set of policy outputs. It's actually about designing a process to enable us to understand how the interaction between algorithmic processes and human beings actually produces outcomes. And we don't see that as a binary equation between that technology causes the issue or that people cause the issue. It's actually the interplay between the two that we don't understand particularly well. And until we understand that better, the policy solutions we have in place at the moment are probably going to be provisional for a while as we try and think about are there negative impacts of some of those policy solutions or unintended consequences. We actually don't have good enough information yet to underpin some of those solutions. And part of what we're trying to do is actually open up a space to understand those processes better, and then enable the conversation to happen with all of those constituencies, and testing all of the models that we've heard of today. I'm sorry I'm going to have to run, but it's just been tremendous to be part of a panel with such rich thinkers and such a range of different perspectives. I wish I could be there with you in person. I'm just very grateful for the opportunity to be able to participate and sit alongside those on the panel today. Ngā mihi
Great.
nui kia koutou.
Great, thanks, Paul, very much. I want to open it up to the room in 5 minutes, but I just wanted to come back to you, David, and potentially to Kate. Let's see how the time goes. Just in thinking about those models, David, that Kate laid out, but also if I can ask you specifically, but please feel free to comment on other things that you heard. Sometimes in the human rights field in particular, there has been, as a result of difficulty in getting a firm consensus, towards legal obligations, the idea of having these kind of voluntary compacts, statements of principle that you sign up to. They're more kind of soft law as opposed to hard law. And I think there are varying levels of confidence in how those work, because yes, they're very transparent. They help to promote dialogue. You learn enormously from them, but they also kind of famously lack teeth. So I'd be interested in some of your thoughts about that, but also if you wanted to pick up on anything that you've heard from our other panelists.
Yeah, that's very bold of you to give me that open-ended last part of the question, because there's just so much richness that was introduced. So I'd say two things. Okay, so the first is that it's true that whether we're talking about the UN guiding principles or other human rights norms out of the Human Rights Council or other institutions, that they're kind of soft law. But I think the effort from those institutions, and this I think also applies to some of the harder law areas, and whether it's the European court's decisions or things that might come out of the DSA and so forth, the idea is that over time, those principles are in effect kind of integrated into national law and national, whether it's regulation or integrated into industry practice. And so I think it's fair to see those things as not having teeth, but I think it's more important to see them as sort of providing opportunities or models for governments and companies to bring into a more regular practice, whether that's legally binding law or company practice or some oversight oriented kind of practice. Doesn't matter so much, but I think that's the objective. So soft law can be really important in that sense, because it doesn't say you must do X, Y, and Z, but it says these are the foundational principles. These are some ways to approach this particular set of problems. Run with it, and that leads to the second point that I wanted to make, which I think is just in keeping with what Kate and Katherine were highlighting. I think the sort of 1,000 flowers bloom model is totally appropriate, and we shouldn't be afraid of that. And sometimes we get caught up in this idea that when we're talking about global norms, that we're somehow suggesting there should be one standard and one outcome that applies across the board. And I don't think that's the right way to think about this. I think it's better to think about the fact that you have, and I think Katherine really got at this, which is there's sort of a baseline, right? Like the baseline, and you get this from the UN guiding principles, which is the baseline is companies need to be thinking about the impact that they have on human rights, and they need to work to prevent or mitigate those harms. Obviously, that can mean their own governance. It can mean how they react to state demands. It can mean a million different things. But the context for different platforms and in different governments and different jurisdictions is going to vary widely. So the same content, which might be incitement to violence in one place, may not have that impact in another. I think that if we think about sort of having a kind of set of minimum standards But those standards can be applied in different ways, according to some standard sets of rules, but they'll leave us with different outcomes across jurisdictions, across industries, across the differences in platforms themselves. And I think we should be okay with that, but we have to have a kind of common language to talk about it. Maybe that, certainly for global platforms, having that sort of inner subjectivity is really important for these kinds of discussions. And I think the international models, at least the international human rights framework, provides some of that sort of baseline vocabulary for us to think these things through.
Just start to get your questions ready. I'm also going to go back to Kate at this stage to ask if you want to comment on any of the other points that have come up from the panelists, or indeed towards how we should think about the Thousand Flowers Bloom model, which I think is where you were heading yourself. In laying out the models, but not necessarily advocating that we rule some of those out too soon before we see how they end up shaping behavior over the longer run.
Yeah, I mean, just to double down on what David just said, but also to pick up this wonderful, wonderful metaphor that Katherine mentioned of the curtains, I was thinking about it and I was like, well, just within the EU, like curtains, like in Sweden, like curtains have a completely different function during the during like the summer months, because there's daylight all the time. So everyone has blackout curtains on their windows, right? Like there are also like, there are ways in which these things that we are treating as single valence, no pun intended, the single valence of like kind of a privacy concern or not a privacy concern or transparency or not, like also have different functionality for different things. And as Katherine even mentioned, like keeping heat in or keeping heat out, or like other types of things. And like this is the and Rana mentioned the idea of the gaming industry, or the idea that there have been all of this development of lanes, and that there is this kind of like, it used to be like there would be we used to be on privacy panels quite a bit. Now I'm basically on speech governance panels, but that wasn't a thing 5 years ago. And so I do think that this is kind of a really important point. And just to double down on David's final point is just that like all of these problems are slightly different. All of that, they are different in different parts of the world. They are different in different types of infrastructure and different types of platforms and different types of products and services. And that changes constantly. That has always been the response of law, is to change with kind of the circumstances and needs and the evolving norms of the time. So that is also true, and not to be like too big picture here, but that's also true of language. And we are developing kind of a language to have conversations around this with. And it's honestly, it's like very refreshing. It feels much more productive, I think anyways, to be having kind of panels like this one where I really feel like there's a dialogue and we're all kind of like drawing from the same base and the same kind of sets of experiences than it did even a couple of years ago. And so that is my optimistic note that I will leave it on. I do think that it is happening. It is going to be a slightly organic process.
And this question of language, it even came up in Anya last night, but also this morning when you said, how should we also conceptualize harms? We know, Rana, you mentioned this too, let's caution against thinking this is all completely new, but we need to make sure we think about harms in an extensive way. The various ways that they can manifest, we need a language to capture that in this space. Some of it will look very much like the language we use elsewhere. I've worked for a lot of my career in atrocity prevention. We have a language that we use for that. But I think that's a little bit part of getting to this stage of intersubjectivity that David talked about. Let me ask if anyone in the audience would like to come in. I'll go here first. Yeah. And then I'll try to ask panelists to come in. I want to come back to both of you, though, at the end, and I will keep my watch close to me. Please.
Thank you. Such an excellent panel. I really appreciate kind of all of the discussion here. It's been very enlightening for me. My name is David Scales. I'm a physician and a sociologist based in New York City, working at New York Presbyterian Hospital. And I appreciate the frameworks that were discussed here. A lot of the work that I do is on medical misinformation, But so one of the things I haven't heard come up in these discussions is not specifically medical misinformation, but the question of expertise, right? This is always challenging in a democracy, and we're essentially talking about how information might flow in a democracy. So I'm interested, as I kind of try to think through some of the frameworks that you guys have been kind of elucidating here. What I see right now is there's very much a market-based approach to medical misinformation as it's kind of traversing the internet. And I would argue that that's not necessarily the best way, but I don't have with the frameworks that you guys have described, what are some of the ways that we could think about this? That's essentially one aspect of the question, but I'm not necessarily trying to just get you guys to comment on my pet issue. One of the things I would say is kind of this let thousand flowers bloom approach. It concerns me because that to me is essentially an approach of let's watch 1,000 healthcare workers quit as they face kind of the burnout from having to deal with a lot of misinformation that they face. So there are externalities to that kind of thousand flowers bloom approach. So I would kind of ask you essentially in a bigger question, not just the question of expertise, but are there specific issues where you see the need to move more quickly than to let thousand flowers bloom?
Very interesting. Does anyone want to jump in on that to start? Catherine, do you want to start? And then I'll ask Kate and David if they want to come in, Rana.
I don't know that I have I think it's an excellent question, and I want to give it a little bit more thought as to how what I'm about to say could be applied more broadly. But I will say that in my experience at one platform in particular, which was Wikipedia, medical information had a different categorization relative to other forms of information as particularly sensitive. It was medical information and biographies of living people for whom there are direct and immediate consequences relative to the information that is provided on those Wikipedia articles. And the prominence of that information in search results meant that the Wikimedia communities and policies had an additional standard of care around how that information was created and who could edit and contribute to that information. And so there may be, I'm so, I'm doing the whole sort of hammer nail Wikipedia sort of thing right now, where that's the model that comes to mind for me. It may be that exists in other places, and I certainly would be open to seeing a governance model around online content that, on a platform-specific basis, that really focuses on providing that same sort of standard of care. But I'm happy to hand over to other panelists on that.
Kate, do you want to come in on this question?
Yeah, I just want to be super clear. The thousand flowers bloom model is not a hands off. Like, it's not a speech. I'm not proposing that as a speech model. I'm proposing that as I wouldn't say 1,000 flowers bloom is the right way to kind of think of it. The way what I was trying to basically summarize was that there are all of these different mechanisms that we have developed in ways that we have thought about addressing different types of harms at different types of levels, including disinformation. And that one approach to all of this, all of these, I would say, opposite of thousand flowers bloom, like a 1,000 turds blooming or something, is just kind of this idea that we can't pick one model to actually solve all of the problems, from disinformation to the imperialist nature of tech platforms in the majority world. This is my point is actually the opposite, which is that we should be applying actively these models and start to be developing best practices to more quickly address and should know at this point that basically what you're describing, which is essentially kind of an expertise or a gatekeeper function that you're proposing as a way of putting to quelling medical disinformation, is I don't know, I would say that we would know that is kind of maybe at this point best addressed directly through platforms, and platforms having stakeholders they can reach out to, and people telling them the ways in which all of how best to design the platform to take down that kind of that disinformation and things like that. That is more what I'm saying, that there should be those types of different models for different types of harms, not that we should just let the harms hang out until something happens and they go away.
David, did you want to come in on this question, or should I move to others?
No, you can move, but I would just say, one, I totally agree with what Kate just said, and to use another perhaps bad metaphor, I'm not suggesting, and I don't think we're suggesting kind of reinvesting in a kind of whack-a-mole approach. It's not about that. It's about standards for sure, rooted in global norms from my perspective, but also the models can vary, and that experimentation could be valuable to us. But it's not about ignoring the different kinds of harms that take place in different kinds of contexts.
Great, thank you. Other questions from the audience? Yeah, Anya. Oh, and sorry, you're next. Yeah.
Anja Kovac, formerly from the Internet Democracy Project and now with Feminist Futures. My question is, I guess, both for David and for Katherine. David, you asked that question so beautifully about the potential of that independent oversight board. I know there are people who are quite enthusiastic about it and even been thinking, is that something that perhaps could be instituted as an independent mechanism within the multilateral system? That's one idea, but there are other models. I was just wondering if you could try to make a beginning to answering your own question. Love to hear more of your thoughts about it. And Katherine, you tried to be a bit more specific, but if you have things to add, or anyone else on the panel, I'd love to hear that. Thanks.
David, you want to start?
Sure, Anya. Hi, thank you for that question and for trying to pin me down. So actually, the oversight board itself has kind of indicated that, hey, they might be open to a kind of cross-industry model. Others want to join this. Come on, let's have that conversation. I'm not sure where that stands right now. That's certainly something they said early on, and whether other platforms would want to join, Meta I'm pretty doubtful about that. But I do think that there was a conversation a couple of years ago that's, for whatever reason, kind of dissipated, but this conversation around what Article 19, the organization called Social Media Councils, which was this idea of, basically taking something like the Oversight Board and expanding it to, to sort of a cross-industry model of non-governmental but multi-stakeholder oversight. And I think that's a model that we should be testing. It has not yet been tested, not even really in the abstract. And I think that, the fact is the Oversight Board is giving us some ideas of how that might work out. Anyway, I'm not sure that's any more specific in answering your question, or I suppose my question, but I do think that that's an approach that exists, and we should be pushing towards, or at least seeking to figure out whether cross-industry sorts of models or cross-industries sort of models might be, valid.
Great, thanks. Katherine.
Yeah, and I do want to make sure we bring Kate in, because she actually literally wrote the definitive article on the Oversight Board. So I think that my primary criticism with the Oversight Board is almost that it has been, this is maybe not shared by everyone, but it's almost been too narrowly tailored to specific application of human rights law, in the sense that it has taken a highly, what I think of as a layperson, not a lawyer myself, a highly legalistic approach to interpreting the sort of right of the takedown request, I don't know how, I'm blanking on the word, not the goodness of it, but like, was it an appropriate takedown request, and has been less concerned with the ways and really evaluating it on a case-by-case standard, and less concerned perhaps with sort of the class or the typology of the case in a way that allows for broader applicability or guidance to product developers. And maybe that's because that's the pressure that they've been getting from Meta. I'm not in those conversations. I've heard it both ways. But certainly from my perspective, it's almost been giving its power away by being so narrow and prescriptive on the cases that it's considered. And I view that as, whether that's because it has been stacked with a bunch of lawyers, no offense to the lawyers in the room, or whether it is because that's really been the guidance that it's been given and told to stay in its lane. I don't know. But to me, that feels like a missed opportunity to engage more sort of holistically and substantively on these issues. The other thing that I would just make a comment on is, it's interesting, They never made me sign an NDA, so I feel like I can say this. I actually talked to Facebook maybe a year plus ago, and they were interested in taking a similar model, perhaps, maybe different, but a similar model of a sort of user-centric approach to policy development. And so instead of being reactive to take down decisions, could there be a group or a group of groups, which is kind of how Wikipedia policy works, which is probably why they were talking to me, that would allow for that sort of representative group to deal with emerging policy questions and perhaps give guidance in the area of content moderation that was descriptive of the issues prior to any of those decisions being made. And I think what happened, as you've seen, there have been lots of challenges that the business has faced, and obviously it's been retooling in public and everything else into the metaverse. So whether that was discarded because of business decisions or because it was deemed to be unfeasible or political, whatever that was, it clearly hasn't gone anywhere. Just because it hasn't gone anywhere doesn't, I actually think that there is a really interesting potentiality for that to exist more broadly across the sector and or at the level of individual platforms. Again, coming back to my point that I think platforms are quite differentiated.
Kate, do you want to take that invitation to say a bit more about the model in response to Anya's question? Or should we just read your piece? But no, that's not good.
Katherine and David are, I think, exactly correct. I would say that the one thing that when I was doing, I have stepped away from a lot of everything that has fallen out of like kind of post oversight board setup, mostly because I was just really like present for so much of like kind of the construction that I just felt like that was like a natural place for me to kind of end my research. But I will say that like, at the end of the day, to Katherine's point, I do think that a lot of the people that made up the oversight board, both staking their reputations and their professional skills and expertise, absolutely, like the people who were on it recapitulated it as a very legal type of institution. The other thing I will say about the people that were on it is a lot of them were institution builders, people, and those were selected on purpose as part of the initial cadre of members, like people who knew how to set up an institution and knew how to be that type of leader. And so the fact that it looks very legal and the fact that it looks like an institution is, I think, very much a product of both like all of the work the meta governance team kind of like decided, but also who they ultimately placed in the hands of. To David's point, there are like and I talk about this in my paper, which is very long and boring, and I wouldn't recommend it. So like the short version is that there's a bunch of different types of ways that an oversight board model can get kind of like taken into the broader industry. One is that yes, the meta oversight board model becomes the oversight board for industry platforms that decide to buy into it. I think that's dangerous, frankly, because I think it threatens to basically set one set of standards for very large online platforms, to borrow like kind of the DSA language, that is like not great for freedom of expression and other types of things. You could have a similar model set up at each types of platforms, essentially. So Twitter makes its own oversight board model. I will say that like, in talking to a lot of different types of platforms that have thought about setting up oversight boards, they have almost universally told me that the market is like not forcing them reputationally, or the PR kind of situation is they're not on a PR dumpster fire the way Facebook is. And so like, they do not have to make this huge gesture of good governance to like kind of the whole world. And so they have no incentive to kind of set up an oversight board. But the last kind of model, I think, is essentially that like it just becomes a meta thing, or that this is just something that they do, or that absent market pressure, that certain types of governance structures like the EU, nation states, like basically regulate that platforms of a certain size have to have something that looks like the oversight board. But I think that those are kind of the models that we're working with.
Thanks very much. So we're getting close to the bottom of the hour, but I want to take maybe 3 or 4 minutes over. We've got 2 sets of questions. Here, is it Anton? Andre, sorry, and Vivek at the back. So why don't you both ask your question, and then I'll come back to the panelists. So Andre first and Vivek, and then I'll come back to the group. And if there's anyone else.
Thank you very much, Andrei Sherbovich, McGill University. The question is, about the 1,000 flowers is good poetry, but the reality is that we have multi-stakeholder approach, and we have international institutions. For example, we have the Internet Governance Forum as the platform for discussion. I am 10,000 participant of the Internet Governance Forum, and this time as well, I'm going to participate there. Of course, it doesn't have decision-making capacity, but I think it is in process of developing. We have examples, for example, of the rule making, maybe in draft and the soft law, like the universal, let's say, the Charter for Rights and Principles for the Internet, and other good examples of rule making. But the question is, what is your actually attitude to these international institutions? Is it possible to develop it from within using the multi-stakeholder approach, and or this? Thank you very much.
Hi, it's a question for anyone who'd like to answer it, which is, in thinking about models of governance, would you put the emphasis on the governance of harms that are produced by the platform model? Or how should we be thinking about the governance of the business models themselves? So this is to tie this conversation to the conversation that we had before lunch, which was much more focused on the economic models that underlie platform capitalism.
And then Bob, I think I'm going to let Bob sneak in with the last question.
So thank you. So one of the things we've been exploring at CG is the role of trade agreements. And so there's something out there called the Digital Economy Partnership Agreement, which is designed to bring together a whole bunch of different discussions. And I'm curious whether what our panel thinks of that type of thing.
Okay, so this is the part where luckily you get to pick and choose a little bit as panelists. So we've got a question about whether we can use trade agreements more creatively. We've got the question about, we have an Internet Governance Forum, which is not a decision-making body, but it's a venue in which we currently discuss governance. And then this question of, what are we actually trying to govern most centrally? Is it harms, or is it business models? Rana, do you want to start?
Just quickly on the trade agreements front, I think that it's an underexplored area of intersection with the technology agenda, and for a variety of reasons, although certain parties in the world have been very successful in using trade and trade agreements as a form of default or de facto influence in the technology sphere, but most parties haven't done that. And there still is an opportunity using the trade mechanism, largely because the mechanism exists. Use the stuff that exists to the best of its potential. And I think just in terms of the other international institutions, like for instance on internet governance, and I think that all of these things need to be renovated with the spirit of the new energy and urgency of the conversation right now. That's correct. Representativeness is often in inverse relationship to effectiveness, which has been part of the challenge of a lot of our international governance institutions for many years. But I think that need not be the case necessarily. I think that there's real opportunity if we start using some of these some new approaches that we've discussed in other aspects of this conversation.
Yeah, think about even not necessarily citizens' assemblies, but it was very interesting listening to Paul about how they have affected communities there, and they must have thought, how is it that we can best do that? Katherine, let me go to you next.
Certainly, I will skip the trade question. I'm not an expert in that by any means, but I think that on the question of, are we governing harms, or are we governing the economic model, I would say we should probably be looking at both. And I think that that's part of the wide-ranging nature of this conversation. You've seen both emerge, largely because they are copacetic. You can't engage one without engaging the other effectively. You can certainly try to engage one without engaging the other, but you're not going to be able to bring those those existing sort of incentives into alignment unless you engage both. On the question of the international fora, at the risk of slipping into geopolitics, I think that those international fora are actually tremendously important, but I don't know that they're the primary space to address these effects or these concerns. I think from my perspective, the space that the international fora are very important is actually a little further upstream, which is thinking about the type of models around openness and interoperability that we want to preserve at the level of internet governance. And the sort of geopolitical angle here is that there are emerging arguments that we're seeing sort of a bifurcation of the internet's governance space into sort of more of a cyber sovereign model, which is sort of where we find the Chinese and some of the incentive structures that they've engaged with around everything from sort of hardware at the level of Belt and Road to software around sort of surveillance and control and censorship and the like. It's certainly not just the People's Republic of China. It's just sort of often emblematic. And certainly the PRC has been kind of explicit that that is a counterweight model that they seek to engage in as a counterweight to sort of Western discourse around open interoperability. And as far as the West, which was largely responsible for setting up many of these fora and articulating the importance of this open multi-stakeholder environment, I think that the West has been tremendously absent. And not only absent because it's expensive and it's messy and, you know, we have other things that we focus on. The West has also been absent, I think, in some part because we're having our own sort of like crisis of democracy and we're not really sure that these models actually work. And so we've kind of lost the faith a little bit. But if you lose the faith and if you lose the participation in those spaces, those spaces will be ceded. And so to the extent that we care about these conversations around online harms from a universal values perspective, we also have to be paying attention to every layer of the stack, which means that we have to be looking upstream to the conversation around internet governance that happens in those spaces. And so I think that these are highly complementary, and to the I'm certainly not saying let's get into sort of a West versus East argument here, but I think if we focus on a values-based argument, it is very important to re-engage with the legitimacy of those spaces and bring people into conversation there.
It's a very interesting point. In other domains, we're seeing echoes of what Katherine is saying. Is it's not the time for democracies to be weak-kneed about some of these things. Yeah. Absolutely. Kate, and then I'll end with David. Kate.
I've spoken a lot, but I will take Vivek's question on the economy and governance. I think that is what I've been focusing on recently with kind of everything that what I've been writing about, as I said before, about this antitrust question. And one of the things that I think is super interesting is how poorly understood the transnational global governance of these platforms is and how cost spreading of governance happens. The model, like the idea that 7 to 8% of Facebook, for example, is based in North America, where the average rate per user is around like $68, and the next closest market is the EU, which is $14 per user, and then rest of world, as they term it, and like everything else are kind of like around $4 to $2, like means that to operate in some of these places where there are many language requirements, that there are all of these very types of difficult to keep up with harms and different types of things, means that in a certain sense there is cost spreading that is happening from the North America is basically subsidizing a lot of the governance, and I think could subsidize potentially more of it, to be honest, if this is how we're going to continue to govern ourselves. But I think that this question is essential to understanding both regulatory and antitrust measures that are being talked about right now. So it's a great question.
Great. And David, let me turn it back to you for any final comments to those questions.
Yeah, those were all great, really great questions. So I guess I would just close by saying one of the amazing things about this panel that, I mean, honestly was very enriching for me was highlighting that, you know, we're having these conversations at really a huge variety of levels. On the one hand, as Katherine was just saying, we're having them sort of vertically at different layers of the stack. So I don't know if there's been conversation about Kiwi Farms, for example, and Cloudflare's reaction to Kiwi Farms. but at levels of infrastructure, of vendors, at all sorts of levels beyond over the top, we're having these same kinds of discussions. So that's happening in one space. The other is obviously the governmental or the regulatory discussions which might be multi-stakeholder. They might be, as Andre was suggesting, in the Internet Governance Forum. They could be in standard setting bodies that we probably don't talk about enough. It could be in the trade context. So this is all happening at a variety of levels. And I think that there might be a tendency to assume that the normative part of it, sort of like what is the underlying normative framework that should apply across all of these different layers and in all of these different conversations, is somehow fixed by the Human Rights Council saying, offline rights apply online. And I think it's just much more contested. And again, I think her comments highlighted this, that they're so contested that we need to be having these conversations in different spaces, and we need to have some regulatory frameworks that are actually implementing, some forms of governance that are rooted in human rights standards. We see some of that, and those are the standards, those are the models that, to my mind, we need to be promoting. I mean, the Let 1,000 Flowers Bloom statement, I think maybe I shouldn't have said that exactly, because maybe it brings some sort of, well, what followed that in Maoist China wasn't so great. So, we don't want to see that. But I do think the idea that investing in these models, standards and norms that are rooted in human rights, and experimenting is fine right now. But the normative foundation absolutely needs to be reinforced and articulated in ways that we're just at the beginning of.
Yeah, absolutely reinforced. Yeah, very good place to end. Thank you so much to the five of you, Paul's not here, for being willing to take on this question, which we know is a hard one, but it was enormously rich, the discussion. We learned a lot, and we did exactly what we hoped we would do, which is brainstorm, try to take it forward, give you all more to think about. And so join me in thanking the panel. We're gonna reconvene at 3:00. So join me in thanking the panel.